There are 13 official classes in D&D 5e, and one of them kinda has to be the worst one. Now, this isn't entirely objective, but most players are pretty sure it's the Ranger. So, let's take a look and see what went wrong here. Hi there, I'm just a second level fighter who likes talking about Dungeons and Dragons, and if you've ever felt done wrong by the mechanical rules of the game, then consider hitting the subscribe button or leaving a like or comment on the video. But enough about that, because today we're covering quite a sore topic that has arisen since the 2024 Player's Handbook dropped. Rangers. Are they actually bad? I see it a lot online and in a few comments of some recent Ranger-related videos, but I get the distinct feeling that the general consensus is that yes, they are. So then, why are Rangers D&D's quote-unquote weakest class? That's what we're going to explore today. Now, everyone will no doubt have their own opinions, and some reasons are vastly more obvious than others, but I personally see it as a series of very strange design choices that led us to this point, which we'll dive into in a bit. That being said, though, the Ranger has a lot of history of strange and flip-floppy design sensibilities, and it kind of feels like the designers haven't ever quite been happy with its implementation. There was an entire Unearthed Arcana proposing a spellless Ranger very early on in 5e, and when Tasha's came around, the Ranger had the most variant features available. Very contentious in the grand scheme of things. However, I do just want to preface the rest of the video by saying that I do actually like Rangers. It's not my least favorite class by any means. And I'm saying this because most of the rest of the video is just gonna be me tearing into the strange mechanical implementation of this class. So yeah, we're gonna be somewhat negative. Hooray! Please don't take this as an entirely serious video either. I mostly find this whole situation a bit funny. But before we get to that, we need to figure out what a Ranger is, both mechanically and thematically. And the best way I can describe it is that it's basically the estranged result of a fighter, rogue, and druid all having a drunken three-way after a very long and very hard adventuring day. It is very clearly a hybrid class that draws inspiration from these three classes, at least mechanically speaking. From a more thematic perspective, the Ranger fits solidly into the outdoorsman archetype. The image of a grizzled warrior and hunter that is more comfortable in the woods than in a bustling urban environment is incredibly strong. And I'd argue that it is integral to a fantasy setting where huge portions of the world are untamed swaths of wilderness. The problem is that this thematic idea of an outdoor expert can quite easily be filled by any of the other classes in the game. But in D&D specifically, Rangers fill a martial role while being classified as a half-caster. The designers have chosen to express the connection to nature here with limited spellcasting and a spell list mostly borrowed from the Druid class. On top of that, Rangers are one of the three specialist classes alongside the Rogue and Bard. The term specialist is a bit of a holdover from the 1D&D playtests where the classes were broken down into small groups, but that has largely fallen away. However, this is one I can't get out of my head. Anyway, Rangers are kinda good at doing ability checks in some of their chosen skills, of which they get a few more of. That being said, any character can excel in this area of the game regardless of class, and some of the non-specialist classes have features that make them better at specific skills too. So arguably, Rangers don't actually specialize that much more than other characters. Now, in the 2014 Player's Handbook, Rangers had features that directly interacted with the environment and gave them a much greater mastery when placed within their favored terrain. Obviously, if their favorite terrain just wasn't present, then they were just kinda useless in that regard. But they have lost that inherent uniqueness in the 2024 PHB. Nowadays, sadly, there really isn't much that sets them apart from a fighter or a rogue, except maybe the spellcasting. So, what exactly are the problems here that caused the Ranger to fall from grace? Because believe it or not, Rangers were actually pretty strong before the release of the 2024 PHB. Well, they just are the weakest martial class in terms of damage dealing. They don't stack up to fighters, paladins, or barbarians, and even rogues and monks kind of outshine them, not to mention the disgusting disparity when proper spellcasters are thrown in for a comparison. Now, obviously, certain builds don't follow this rule. The Horizon Walker doesn't care if its parent class is weak at all, it still slaps far beyond its weight class, but we'll discuss that one a bit later. The biggest issue that most people immediately identify, and this is also a major factor why the Ranger just doesn't deal a lot of damage, is the fact that Hunter's Mark is so fundamentally tied to the Ranger class now. We'll focus on this one individually shortly, but it is particularly egregious. Another problem that isn't necessarily the Ranger's fault is that the 2024 PHB just kinda nuked the effectiveness of ranged weapons, at least indirectly. And surprise, surprise, the Ranger is presented as a class that is pushed towards using ranged weapons. The issue here is that the sharpshooter feat was gutted and no longer provides massive damage to cover up the holes in a class. Yes, we can now take Great Weapon Master on a longbow or heavy crossbow and it will give us its damage bonus. But the ability score increase is wasted along with the second half of the feat, which only works with melee. Crossbow Expert itself, which is entirely necessary to use a crossbow at level 5 or higher, also feels like a tax on a character build. So rangers are now kinda pushed towards melee if they want to deal optimized damage. Which, as a reminder, definitely isn't the only way to play the game. That being said, dual wielding is a lot better now and a great thematic choice. But using something like a greatsword with Great Weapon Master is just solidly the best damage dealing option for almost all rangers now. As mentioned, rangers did also lose some of their weird uniqueness and it really shows. They don't really do anything different from, say, a fighter, rogue, or druid nowadays, and in most cases they just do it worse too. Finally, level 11 is the point where the problems properly start showing. Rangers are actually great at low levels, especially if using scimitars. But once we reach tier 3, everyone else shoots ahead and leaves us in the dust. Alright, let's talk about the most hated addition and change to Rangers. I'll start by saying that Hunter's Mark is a pretty great spell, but it is a god-awful class feature. Yeah, the designers chose to make Hunter's Mark the core feature for Rangers. No one asked for this, and everyone gave the most obvious fix to make this good, but no, we're stuck with Hunter's Mark infesting the class. For some context, there are 3 other Ranger class features later on that attempt to make Hunter's Mark better and more usable, and none of them succeed. And that's just the base class. Some of the subclasses also have features to make this stupid spell more desirable. Anyway, I'll say it isn't awful at low levels, in fact it's quite strong, especially when dual wielding. Adding 1d6 force damage on every attack against a specific target really starts to stack up. At least until that target expires and we have to use a bonus action to shift it to a new target, or until our concentration is broken. Speaking of which, that's the biggest issue here. Hunter's Mark requires concentration, and no matter what bonuses we slap on top of it, that won't change the reality that we can't use other concentration spells while wasting our lives with our core class feature. The Ranger spell list is filled with some awesome spells that just so happen to require concentration too, like Ensnaring Strike, Conjure Animals, Conjure Woodland Beings, and the most sad of all, Swift Quiver, the 5th level Ranger only spell that would be amazing to feel good about using. So the choice is incredibly simple but incredibly frustrating. Do we use our core class feature, or do we use our awesome spells? Because we can't do both at the same time, and that specifically has a massive effect on our performance in combat. And yes, the designers very specifically refused to remove the concentration on Hunter's Mark for balance concern reasons, and the biggest issue here is that they're not wrong either. The Ranger absolutely jumps up a few tiers of magnitude if Hunter's Mark no longer requires concentration. But at this point, I really don't care anymore. Just make it stop being so restrictive. Another glaring problem here is that the Ranger subclasses are so wildly inconsistent. They are perfectly positioned to help cover up the issues in the base class, but very few of them actually do. And this is abundantly clear with the 2024 subclasses, which aren't very good. Except maybe the Beastmaster. But it's been an issue since the early days of 5e, so I guess at this point we're just keeping with tradition. To illustrate the issue a bit more, let's take the Horizon Walker from Xanathar's Guide as an example. It can add an extra d8 to one attack per turn as a bonus action, and this scales up to 2d8 at level 11, the point where the subclasses should be giving a power boost. On top of that, it lets us take an additional attack at level 11 if we target a separate creature with each attack we have. And then also at level 9 it gets access to the haste spell, which just gives it another attack. So, surprise surprise, it just kinda brute forces its way through any issues with the base class. It also doesn't care about Hunter's Mark because it consistently uses its bonus action for something else, and once it reaches level 9, it starts concentrating on haste instead. Compare that to the 2024 Hunter that can choose to deal an extra 1d8 damage or make an extra attack against a nearby enemy. And of course, we shouldn't forget that it also lets us plink out a single instance of Hunter's Mark damage once per turn to a nearby enemy too. It's quite frankly abhorrent and disgusting. What world are we living in that these two subclasses exist for the same class in the same game? And yes, many of the Ranger subclasses are a lot closer in power to the Hunter than the Horizon Walker. I do understand that. But I will also bring up the Gloomstalker really quickly. It used to be accepted as the strongest subclass before the 2024 PHB, meaning it was on par with or actually better than the Horizon Walker. However, it got absolutely annihilated once the book dropped. It no longer adds much power at all and kinda punishes you for not having high wisdom. It's amazing. Okay, let's take a look at how the Ranger stacks up to the other martial classes out there, and a significant difference really becomes clear at level 11. So, for some context, martial classes generally have certain levels at which they scale in power and get a power boost. The two important levels are level 5 and 11. 5 is when we all unlock extra attack except the rogue, and 11 is when we are prepared for tier 3 where the game is supposed to get a lot more scary. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule, by the way. Rogues have much more gradual power scaling than any of their counterparts, and yes, they are kinda technically a martial class, at least when it comes to combat functionality. But barbarians and monks also scale at different levels, with barbarians unlocking Brutal Strike at level 9 and monks getting their third Flurry of Blows attack at level 10. But the two classes rangers are often compared to the most, fighters and paladins, do scale up at level 11. Fighters get another extra attack, and paladins get to add 1d8 radiant damage on all of their attacks, which actually sounds a hell of a lot like Hunter's Mark, only it doesn't require concentration or a bonus action, and it isn't limited to a single target. So, at this point, you may be wondering, what do rangers get at level 11? Well, nothing. They get absolutely nothing from their base class. They do, however, get a subclass feature at that level. But as we discussed, their subclasses are all over the place, and a lot of them don't give something good enough to keep up with the fighters and paladins. At least consistently, because those two classes always have their level 11 power switched on. Can these problems be fixed though? Yes. Changing Hunter's Mark so that it either doesn't require concentration or just isn't a class feature might solve the biggest problems here. That being said, removing it or significantly overhauling it as a class feature would take a lot of effort and work to get just right. Removing concentration here also isn't ideal because it will just shoot the ranger up in power drastically. If cast at 3rd level, it lasts 8 hours and can just be switched on with a bonus action in combat, so it can be precast and there is no way to get rid of it. Not to mention the level 13 class feature Relentless Hunter that would need to be replaced, as it literally just makes concentration on the spell unbreakable by damage. There are also multi-classing concerns, cause of course Hunter's Mark doesn't just work with weapon attacks, why would it? It's all round just a proper mess. I firmly believe that mistakes were made when trying to turn this silly little spell into a core class feature and identity. The other main thing to fix is the level 11 features for all ranger subclasses across the board. If the base class is a problem that won't let us keep up with other martials, then our subclasses should solve this. And by the way, that's kinda what they were positioned to do because they actually give a feature at this level. The problem here, though, is that we would need a very superficial level of homogenization. Every single ranger subclass would be limited to giving consistent combat power at level 11, and that seems kinda boring. But as always, does this even need to be changed? One class must be the weakest, so why not the ranger this time around? The problems only really consistently show themselves when optimization takes place after all. I do, however, want to ask a bit of a darker question. Does the Ranger even need to exist as an entirely separate class in the current edition of D&D? Now, before I say the words that are very clearly on your screen in front of you, please understand that I love the Ranger. My second character ever in 5e was a half-orc hunter that was a replacement for a Tempest cleric in the Lost Mine of Phandelver starter adventure. My little boy with his hand axes and longbow managed to score the killing blow on a retreating young green dragon, and honestly there haven't been many other moments in D&D as a player that have topped that for me. So yes, I genuinely cherish this class and all its weirdness and Bear Grylls flavor. As for the question of whether it should exist, I hate to say it, but I don't really think so. The amount of thematic and even mechanical overlap in 5e is astonishing, and Rangers are one of the most egregious examples. It could have very easily been a fighter or rogue subclass. The sad fact is that the class in its current form brings nothing new. The 2014 version wasn't much better either. However, the flavor here is amazing, but flavor can be sprinkled onto any mechanical rig in a role-playing game. And if that rig is just a worse fighter with some low-level druid spells they aren't allowed to use because of a really stupid class feature that requires concentration, then what's the point? Oh, and this isn't a new question either. People have been asking this for the longest time. The former and current iterations of this class just aren't entirely unique enough to justify their existence, at least in my opinion. Now, if instead of Hunter's Mark we had a permanent beast companion, trust me, I would 180 on this faster than you can say Strider. But that just isn't the case right now. Alright, that was the Ranger and its plethora of issues. I hope it wasn't too negative, but it is what it is. But how do you feel about the current version of this class and its subclasses? I'm interested to see if anyone has a nuanced take, because they're really difficult to find online. I suppose that's just an internet problem though. Anyways, if you've made it this far into the video, then you're a legend and I really do appreciate you. What other class or classes do you think could get axed? Paladins, anyone? But yeah, that'll do it for this one. Cheers.